When you raise children, they're not in debt to you. That was like your job. That's what you're supposed to do.
So there's a huge misunderstanding that he is propagating here. The Bible actually has a very, very clear stance on this topic. Do children owe their parents? And the answer, according to the Bible, is absolutely yes, both in the Old and New Testament. And part of the reason why this is so confusing is that there's a collision between West and East in the way that Dave Ramsey is sort of framing this. All right. So he's framing this in incredibly black and white terms in terms of like debt obligations, right? The West has what's called a justice guilt culture, and the East, they have a shame honor culture. And the Bible was very much written in a shame honor culture lens. And the gospel, even, it's addressing the shame that's created in a shame honor culture. And a lot of what happened through the gospel as we came out of the shame of a shame honor culture, it really almost created this justice guilt culture that we have today. So that's kind of sort of complex sociology, but I think it's actually playing deeply into his reactions here because our culture does not understand honor. And honor does, it is a kind of debt, but it isn't the kind of debt that shows up in a extremely black and white balance sheet. And that's, I think, where this is getting confusing. I think Dave Ramsey lives in an extremely concrete world in which it's all of these lines are very, very bright and clear. And in an honor culture, it is not super clear. So that's one, I think, part of what's creating the confusion here. Now, the reason why I think the Bible specifically lays this out is in the Ten Commandments, it says very clearly, honor your father and mother. And that word honor was understood both in the Old Testament and then is reiterated in the New Testament, specifically around providing for your parents in their old age. The word, and so that's why Jesus was confronted in the Gospels by the brothers who came in and said to him, what's going on here with honor? Like there was a conflict. There was another story where Jesus was confronted because there was a family that there were children who were not giving their parents money because they gave it all to the church. In their day and age, it was honored into the temple, right? So essentially, they said, look, we're going to dedicate all of these earnings instead of giving their parents. And Jesus actually confronts that. So you have a fine way of setting aside the word of God for the traditions of man, right? This was one of the ways that he actually confronted the Pharisees. And because of course they benefit from when children do this, in this manner. So that I don't think there's any, I've never heard any controversy around this. And that the Bible clearly teaches that honoring your father and mother is not just being nice to them. Like we think about that in those terms again, because we separate anything financial because that's so concrete. We can't think about honor in that way. We think about honor as, basically don't say mean things about them or occasionally maybe say nice things about them. That is not at all what this is talking about. It's in the Ten Commandments because there's a certain connection between the generations. And then in the New Testament, you have even a clearer example of this. And in one of the most concrete passages in the Bible is really about how the generations are to together and treat one another. It comes from 1 Timothy 5, and this is we're given an even more clear. Let me pull this up real quick and just read this passage. So I'm looking at 1 Timothy 5, where it talks about widows, and it's describing what, and this is where we get kind of that famous passage. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially the members of his household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And so this is a really critical element of what it means to actually be a part of God's kingdom, is to provide for your family. But it's also talking about parents, and that's primarily the context of this entire passage, right? It talks about widows, and if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents. It's interesting, this phrase, some return to their parents. There's lots of ways that this is translated. Let me read this in a couple of the translations. It basically has the same nuance, but I think it's really helpful to see this. New Living Translation: if she has children or grandchildren, their first responsibility is to show godliness at home and repay their parents for taking care of them. Repay their parents. That sounds like there's maybe an obligation. So This is to me is so strange that this is like so obvious to Christians today that there is no connection or obligation between the generations, that the obligation only goes one direction. It only goes from parents to children. Now that's where I think that's primarily where the obligation goes. Paul even says this, in one of his epistles. He says something like, it's really the duty of parents to provide for their children, not children for their parents. That is the normal way it should flow. Like, wise parents should be constantly thinking about how to make sure that their children are cared for. But there are situations, and so there's a disaster that's occurred in First Timothy 5, right? You have a widow, and in the case that there's a widow in the home or in the family, then this creates an obligation for the children to care for their widowed mother, right? So we know that in certain circumstances, and this was the insurance policy of every family, that if you because as you're getting older, there was no Social Security, there was no government assistance for aging parents. Aging parents were primarily trying to provide for their children, care for their children. But if a disaster strikes, and in this family, they're describing two disasters back to back, right? A flood and a fire. And if this actually happened, then wow, it does seem like there's an obligation there.